Pamela, and you're listening to Watchman on the Pod. Uh, I moved in my bedroom. Hopefully, the dogs will not be so loud now because they're in the living room. I'm in the bedroom. We're going to continue. And history today, John Rogers, Sealed with Blood. The story of the first Protestant martyr of Mary Tudor's reign by Tim Shenton. Mary was also nicknamed Bloody Mary. Here we go, chapter 3. The Matthew's Bible. David Dannell, in his magistral work, The Bible in English, says about Rogers, to this steadfast and courageous Reformed pastor and preacher of the English-speaking Christian world owes a debt of particular gratitude. Working with, apparently, the printer Matthew Crom in Antwerp, John Rogers put together in 1537 a handsome, thick folio of a large, complete Bible, well printed in clear black letter in double columns. William Tyndale and Rogers. William Tyndale, who had published his translation of the New Testament in 1526 and that of the Pentateuch in 1530, earnestly desired to complete the whole Bible. There is no positive proof of Rogers' initial involvement, although their friendship suggests that he helped when and where he could, and that he had some knowledge of the character and condition of the work. He was probably a scholar of the Greek New Testament, and he had a good grasp of Hebrew and Aramaic. If this had been not the case, Rogers would not have been so ready to take up and complete the unfinished manuscripts after Tyndale's arrest. Rogers arrived in Antwerp late in 1534, and Tyndale was arrested in May 1535. So their personal association could not have lasted more than a few months. Nevertheless, it would not have taken long for both men to form a common bond. It is not hard to imagine the two men sitting in Tyndale's study in the house of Thomas Ponce, discussing the scriptures and encouraging one another in the faith, and then busily engaged in translating the Bible into their own language. In all probability, both men failed to realize the greatness of their mission and the effect their work would have on the future of the church. Thomas Ponce, in whose house Tyndale and probably Rogers lived, was a wealthy merchant and described as a good, shrewd friend and loyal sympathizer. He was the brother of Lady Anne Walsh of Little Sodbury and the head of the merchant adventurer's house in Antwerp. It was there that he sheltered Tyndale as his sister had in England. John Fox's 1563 biography of Tyndale concludes with an account probably written by Thomas Ponce and received from him or someone close to him. When Tyndale was arrested on or near the 21st May, 1535, the Procureur General, Pierre Duffif, immediately raided Ponce's house and confiscated all Tyndale's property, including his books and papers. However, the Old Testament historical books in English were probably safely with Rogers. Tyndale was taken to the castle of Vilvoorde, outside Brussels, where he was imprisoned for the next 16 months. Ponce did all he could to help. He wrote to his brother John at the English court saying that the king never had a truer hearted subject to his grace than Tyndale. The king's grace should have of him at this day as high a treasure as of any man living. There be not many perfecter men than this man, as knows God. Initially, it seemed as though Ponce's efforts had succeeded, for he was told at Brussels that Tyndale would be released to him. Henry Phillips, who had betrayed Tyndale for cash, fearing that his reward was under threat, announced to the authorities that Ponce was a dweller in the house of Antwerp, and there had been a succour of Tyndale, and was one of the same opinion. The Procureur General arrested Ponce and imprisoned him. He was kept under house arrest in Brussels while a case was built up against him. The Procureur General spent 5 or 6 days examining him on more than 100 articles before drawing up about 24 against him, which were passed on to the commissioners, who then appeared every 8 days to continue the prosecution and to hear Ponce's defense. which was hampered by restrictions placed on him. This went on from the beginning of November to the end of January. After being held in Brussels for about 12 or 13 weeks, Ponce realized he would be put to death, and on the night he was to be transferred to a stronger prison, he escaped and at dawn slipped out of Brussels. Horsemen were sent after him, but he knew the land and made it to England. His wife refused to join him. He was banished from the Netherlands, and his business and domestic arrangements collapsed and never recovered. In 1547, 12 years later, on his brother's death, he succeeded to the ancestral manor of North Ockenden, but was too poor to live there. He died in 1562 and was buried at St. Dunstan's in London, despite the fact his family home was in Essex, something like that. Rogers takes up Tyndale's manuscript. At Tyndale's arrest, it was not known where his bulky manuscript translation of Joshua to 2 Chronicles was located. He could not have passed on that information at the time of or after his arrest because that event occurred unexpectedly through the treachery of Phillips, and he was not allowed to enjoy any conversation with his former acquaintances during his imprisonment. Somehow the manuscript survived the illegal raid on Ponce's house and in all likelihood was in the possession of Rogers, who made sure it was printed in what became the most influential of all the early printed English Bibles, the Matthew's Bible. If Rogers was not personally involved in the work at the time of Tyndale's arrest, it is certain he started his labors immediately after that event, or how else could he have completed the work ready for the publication of the entire volume in 1537? No doubt from his own inclination and the encouragement of Tyndale's friends, he took up the manuscript and while ministering to his congregation, devoted his spare time to the Matthew's Bible. David Dennell thinks that Rogers was an ideal person to take Tyndale's work further. He was a graduate with an undoubted flair for language, and it is likely that he was already a scholar of the Greek New Testament. In the Matthew's Bible, we can see his grasp of Hebrew and Aramaic versions of the Old Testament in Greek and Latin, and his use of recent European work on the scriptures, as well as his knowledge of the fathers. His understanding of the religious needs of ordinary people of the plowboys of the Ditmarsh region was one with his later power as a London preacher. Chapter 4, the translation and the publishers. A large portion of the Old Testament, extending to the beginning of Isaiah, had been finished and printed before the subsequent publishers, Richard Grafton and Edward Whitechurch, two citizens of London, became involved in the undertaking. This had been accomplished through the private subscriptions of Tyndale's friends, most probably the English merchants at Antwerp. Grafton and Whitechurch learned in some way that this translation was already well advanced. They hurried to Antwerp to see what terms could be arranged with those involved and almost at once agreed to be the future proprietors and underwriting an edition of 1,500 copies, which were shipped to England. Grafton was so confident of the financial success of this adventure that he put into it almost his entire fortune. All the books so far had been supervised by Rogers and printed, for at this point in the Matthew's Bible, a new numbering starts and a title page is inserted with the words, "The Prophets" in English, for the reverse of which above and below a large woodcut are the initials R.G. and E.W., Richard Gratson and Edward Whitechurch, indicating the point at which the new proprietors became involved with the work. They purchased the sheets already printed and employed Rogers to prepare and complete the remainder. Richard Grafton was the son of Shrewsbury Skinner. His grandfather had been a chaplain at court to Edward V and then to Prince Arthur Tudor. He raised his grandson and apprenticed him to the prominent Cheapside grocer John Blagg, whose customers included Thomas Cranmer and Thomas Cromwell. Richard Grafton was admitted freeman of the Company of Grocers in 1534. He soon met and befriended a member of the Haberdashers' Company, Edward Whitechurch. After the Matthew's Bible, both men concentrated their efforts on the folio Bible known as the Great Bible, 1539, which was a revision of the Matthew's Bible, but without the marginal notes, which, because of their Protestant bias, caused difficulties for some senior English clergy who were still nervous about allowing the laity to read the Bible in English, especially if the notes led to it being read in a radically Protestant manner. In some ways, the notes in the Matthew's Bible were published too early in the Reformation to make it the favored choice for use in churches. 7 other editions of the Great Bible were published before December 1541, and 5 separate editions of the New Testament of Roger's version was printed during that time, in addition to several by other hands. Soon after Thomas Cromwell's fall, 1540, Grafton was confined to Fleet Prison for 6 weeks, having printed a ballad in Cromwell's praise, but he soon regained royal favor and became known as the king's printer throughout the reign of Edward VI. Grafton printed the first book of homilies in 1547 and the first book of common prayer 2 years later. On the accession of Lady Jane Grey, he printed her proclamation, for which Queen Mary deprived him of the office of royal printer. After enduring a few more weeks' imprisonment, he made peace with Mary, but was not restored to his former position. After he retired from business as a printer, he was elected a member of Parliament on several occasions, was twice warderer of the Grocers' Company, and became a master of Bredwell Hospital, founded in 1553 by King Edward. In spite of his efforts to obtain wealth, it appeared he was reduced to extreme poverty in later life, and after 1570, he proposed to become a public informer of certain statutes concerning the cloth workers. He died about 1572. He is perhaps best known as a chronicler. Edward Whitechurch, Grafton's right-hand man in many of his undertakings, Edward Whitechurch was also a grocer who accepted with enthusiasm the doctrines of the Reformation. He, too, was confined to prison for 6 weeks for printing unlawful books. Both Whitechurch and Grafton received jointly exclusive patent for printing church service books and an exclusive right to print primers in Latin and English. In Edward's reign, Whitechurch was on terms of intimacy with Protestant leaders, and his press was always busy. He reprinted an edition of the New Testament in small octavo, many editions of the Prayer Book and the Great Bible in small folio. In 1548, Rogers was with Edward Whitechurch at his house in Fleet Street, and the little volume he produced bears on the title page that combined monogram, but Whitechurch was the sole publisher. On the accession of Mary, he probably fled to Germany, but resumed business in London during the reign of Elizabeth, publishing a new edition of Thomas Fair's Regiment of Life in 1560. It was his last undertaking. He married the widow of Thomas Cranmer, Margaret, and died in 1562, being buried at Camberwell. The translated manuscripts of the Matthew Bible. It is customary to attribute the Pentateuch and New Testament to Tyndale with minor variations, the latter from the so-called final GH revision of his 1534 version. The books of the Old Testament from Ezra to Malachi, including Jonah, are taken from Coverdale with some significant changes, as also in the Apocrypha. But the historical books of the Old Testament from Joshua to 2 Chronicles are very different from Coverdale's. It is now known that the English translation from the Hebrew of the 9 historical books ending at 2 Chronicles is the work of Tyndale. Rogers' work. On his arrest, Tyndale left certain finished and unfinished manuscripts, being complete or incomplete translations of various parts of the Old Testament, with copious notes, all of which were in the possession of Rogers, and to which he confined himself. Grafton, who wanted a speedy return for his outlay, urged him to finish the work as quickly as possible. In his haste, Rogers used the manuscripts of Tyndale as far as he could, and then, to satisfy the demands of his new employer, supplied the deficiencies from the published translation of Coverdale, which he corrected and altered as far as time would allow. All of this amounted to a huge volume of work for Rogers to have completed in such a short space of time, especially as Tyndale had not prepared him for the task before his capture. The entire volume was printed in Antwerp, apparently at the press of Matthew Crom, the latter part of July 1537, which means Rogers was only engaged on the project for a little more than 2 years. He was never keen to adapt Coverdale's version without making many and considerable alterations, omissions, and additions in the portions of the Matthew Bible attributed to him. He supplied his own translation for the short prayer of Manasseh in the Apocrypha, which Coverdale had omitted. For Job and Isaiah, he used the commentaries of, I can't pronounce that name. What's that name? Ascolampadius, and even translated afresh the opening chapters of Job, making them more coherent, which Coverdale had not done well. Nor did he follow Coverdale's arrangement very closely, and in one example rejected 3 verses not found in the Hebrew that Coverdale had inserted into the 14th Psalm. So he did his work, brothers and sisters. The man did his work because he knew the Hebrew, the Greek, the Aramaic. He went over Coverdale's work. He did not copy it word for word. No. So right there it is. He took Tyndale's Pentateuch and New Testament, and after making some 330 changes to the former, made them accessible to a more influential English readership. All this means that it was thanks to John Rogers that these valuable base, the Bishop's Bible, which in turn was the main foundation of the authorized version of 1611. Rogers may be credited with having effectively aided in the production of the classical English translation of the Bible. Rogers notes, interestingly, Stephen Gardiner, who always bitterly opposed the English version of the Bible regarding any departure from Scripture's original Latin as heresy, addressed Rogers as Thomas Matthew during his trial. He was not so much opposed to the preacher, Rogers, as to the translator, Matthew, for he was astute enough to foresee that the English version was a serious threat to his church and religion. The marginal notes alone are copious. For the text of the French Bibles of Lefebvre, 1530 and 1534, both printed in Antwerp by Martin de Keyser and Aleftane in 1535, and from his own knowledge, he greatly expanded the marginal notes in both testaments. In Tyndale's Pentateuch, he omitted 3 or 4 of the original marginal comments against the Pope and inserted his own notes from Pelican's Latin commentary. He supplied marginal notes to Tyndale's historical books and New Testament from the French Bibles, which meant that the whole volume had over 2,000 marginal notes, excluding cross-references. His notes were pioneer work in Protestant glossing in English. It may also be said that the Catholic clergy regarded his notes and prefaces as even more dangerous than the text itself. In the list of books prohibited in 1542, as appears in the official register of Bonner, they are particularly specified and especially described as of Thomas Matthew's doing. However, as Martin Holt Dodderwick points out, while Tyndale and Rogers in the Matthew's Bible especially have been accused of writing polemical notes, a reading of their marginal displays few such annotations. Rather, the notes consist primarily of lexical explanation or comparison of a difficult passage to others which explain it, albeit with an identifiably Protestant slant. In the words of David Donnell, John Rogers needs more recognition for his contribution to marginal elucidation. Like Tyndale, his scholarship was at the plowboy's disposal. He was able to refer the reader to the Chaldee, the Aramaic version of the Old Testament, commonly called the Targum, and to the Greek Septuagint version, to elucidate Hebrew obscurities. He also took from the French version's chapter summaries throughout the whole Bible. Remembered by few now, sometimes only for his reading of the Hebrew Hallelujah as praise the everything, John Rogers, though neglected today, was a modern biblical scholar. In 1549, John Day, John Fox's friend and printer, and others published several editions of the Bible and New Testament in which they revised the marginal notes of the 1537 edition and described them as the notes of Thomas Matthew, who by then most people knew to be John Rogers. Praise God. All right, brothers and sisters, going to end that there and pick it up next in chapter 5. I find that very interesting. So he may have used that pseudonym or whatever they call it, the pen name, Thomas Matthew, but people knew. I mean, he was on trial and the man even called him Thomas Matthew. So it wasn't like a big hidden secret. Obviously, it doesn't sound like it. All right, brothers and sisters, keep your eyes on Jesus. Your nose in the book, which is the Word of God. And embed the Word of God upon the tablets of your hearts, so you and I will not sin against God or be deceived. I love you all so very, very much. You have a great, great Sabbath. Sabbath is tonight. Bye-bye.